Good evening and welcome to this special event on behalf of the New York Society Library. I am Sarah Holliday, the library's head of events, and it's an honor to be here with author Morgan Talty. Do take a look at the chat at the right side of your screen for the link to purchase your copy of his book from our independent friends at the Corner Bookstore. And do please add your questions and comments to the chat throughout the presentation. A quick word about Mr. Talty and his book, Night of the Living Rez. He is a citizen of the Penobscot Indian Nation where he grew up. His work has appeared in Granta, the Georgia Review, Tri-Quarterly, Narrative Magazine, and elsewhere, including recently the Guardian newspaper, I happen to notice. He won the 2021 Narrative Prize and the 2022 New England Book Award for Fiction. His book work has been supported by the Elizabeth George Foundation and the National Endowment for the Arts. He teaches courses in both English and Native American Studies and is on the faculty at the Stone Coast MFA in Creative Writing, as well as the Institute of American Indian Arts. I will just add that if you have not yet read Night of the Living Rez, you are in for a treat. I truly agree with the blurb from Tommy Orange, who said, reading this book, I literally laughed and cried. So I'm pleased to welcome to our virtual stage, author Morgan Talty. Thank you very much for being here.
Thank you so much for having me.
So I'm going to kick off with just the most obvious question that you've probably been asked a million times, but it's still interesting. How did you come to write this particular book?
That is a great question. I feel like, I was always sort of a storyteller growing up, and, I loved storytelling. And when I got to college, I, was like, oh, I can do this in written form. And I sort of fell in love with literature, and I just pursued it. I kept writing. There was something about it that I had to do, and or that I wanted to do. And when I went into my MFA program, I was like, oh, I have to write something of length. And I decided to write a story collection. And I wrote this book there ultimately. And I started it in 2015, and it ultimately was. The first story I ever wrote was Night of the Living Rez, the actual title story. So the second to last story, which is interesting. And, then I wrote, 20, 25, 30 failed stories until finally, I had something that looked like a book. And so it was a very strange process that just like, I guess, a desire for me to tell stories, and then ultimately, finding these characters and these situations and, chiseling it out until it finally, took shape into something, that we have today.
When I read the book, it had not been spoiled for me, but I'm about to spoil it for everybody else. That the stories are interconnected, and I'm right in saying that there's one character in particular and his family who are consistent through all the stories, and it visits them at different points in their lives. So sorry, folks, if I just spoiled that for you, but I promise it does not spoil the enjoyment. So it seems like coming up with the order of the stories must have been a huge part of that process. Is there more to add about that?
Yeah, definitely. I mean, I set out to write, this story collection, and I had Night of the Living Rez, the title story, which had David as a young adult, 17 or 18. And then I had Smoke's Last at the time. And then I had a story called It's All There, which was a very early draft story between David and his grandmother, that the emotion of which I went on to capture in The Blessing Tobacco. And so I had those three stories, and they're all told from David's point of view. And I was like, you know what? Why don't I just write a story collection, the same character, they're each individual stories. And I start, with David as a boy, and then I move all the way to when he's an adult or young adult in Night of the Living Rez. And so I did that. I went and wrote in different orders. I wrote In a Jar first. I was like, that'll be my starting point. And it is very much, an introduction to David and his family. And then I went and wrote, a total of 14 or 15 stories, all told from David's point of view. And I chose 10 that looked the best. And I was like, all right, this is the collection. And I looked at it and I was like, this is terrible. This is not a good book. Because it was it wasn't a traditional story collection in that each story was different. You pick up Lauren Groff, for example, and her story collection, everything's different. You pick up Karen Russell, there's a different characters, different places. Themes may be the same, but this was the same character, the same place, the same family, and the only thing that bound them together was that they were the same people, the same place, yet they stood alone. That I was like, you could read them in any order, and some may be like, oh, that sounds pretty appealing, but when I read it, I was like, this is really boring, and so I shelved it, and I was like, I'll go do something else, and I went on to write the story Burn with Dee and Fellis. At the time when I was writing that, I didn't have any intention for Dee to be David. Spoiler for those of you who have not read it. Well, not really a spoiler, but I had no intention for Dee to be David. I went into that story being like, I'm writing an entirely different story. It's set in the same place, but an entirely different story. And there's a line in Burn where Fellis says, because he has his hair frozen in the snow, he says to Dee, he says, "Get me out, Dee." Fellis said, "Dee, get me out." And I knew because of like rhythmic purposes with the piece that I had to name the character there, that Fellis had to say the other character's name. And I had been writing in David's point of view for so long that I wanted to call him David. But I was like, no, this isn't David. So I put the letter D in as a placeholder, and I was like, I'll figure his name out later. But I could not figure his name out. I don't know why, but I was like, it has to start with a D. I was like, is it Darren, Daryl? What is it? And then finally, I just kept saying D, the letter, over in my head, over and over and over again, until I was like, wait, maybe he goes by D. And I put 2 E's after it, and it was like this light bulb moment with this like tiny little detail. And I was like, okay, I didn't want this to be David, but this is him all grown up. And I was like, what happened? And so that, led me to writing all these Dee and Fellis stories with no real order to them, just again, standalone stories. And, this question of what happened prompted me to go back to that book I'd shelved with all the David stories. And I noticed that, there was all the David stories, and they existed on a timeline, that moved linearly. And then I had all these Dee and Fellis stories that moved linearly as well, or so they seemed. But when I put them together, there's a huge gap in time missing. And agents, well, not really at the time agents, but it didn't work. Like, I wanted to go for the short story collection. So in order to keep it a short story collection, because, a story collection for me is stories get their power from what's left out, as opposed to novels that get their power from, the specificity that's there and the, and all-encumbering knowledge that is, within it. So I was like, well, what happens if I kind of hide the fact that time is missing, and I let the reader figure it out? And so I was like, okay, well, how about we try a zigzag pattern? And it kind of just sort of worked out that way. And I was like, we'll do Burn, a D story, a David story, a D story, a David story, all the way to the end. And I don't know, it just like, it worked for the book, like the ordering and the structuring of it. It was so strange, the moment I have a picture of it somewhere, but I have printouts of the David stories laid out chronologically on the floor. And then I have the D stories where I thought they were supposed to go in between, working visually. And then it was about, this revision back and forth to making sure, there was no overlap, and there was that they weren't implicating themselves in a larger plot, so to speak. Because I feel like the plot of the book is really this question about what happened, yet it's not a question that needs to be answered for anybody to enjoy the specific stories, at least in my mind. So I feel like that's what was kind of like unique about what I discovered in writing this book, and in its structure, and for interconnected story collections in general, because that's one of the big things. It's like, well, could this have been a novel? Could this, are there ways to have made this more of just a short story collection? And, it's a genre that I think is like still figuring itself out, even though it's like been around forever.
Yeah, that's great. And certainly makes sense to me as a reader, the feeling that possibly there's going to be a big reveal, and then there are some reveals, but there isn't, it's not, I don't know how to describe. You just described it better. I don't need to keep describing it, but I think it's very effective. One of the things I noticed, but too late myself to realize if there was a pattern or not, is that there are shifts in tenses between the stories. Some of them are told in the present tense and some of them are in the past tense, if I'm correct. Can you talk a little bit about how that worked with these stories and how you think about what's the difference between working in different tenses?
Yeah, I love present tense. I think there's more past tense in this book than there is present tense. But I love present tense. There's just such an immediacy to it. It's very hard to pull off, which is probably why I only have it a little bit in the book, because it is such a difficult tense to use really, really effectively. Past tense just seems like the default, thing. But for present tense, I automatically think of Safe Harbor because that story is entirely in present tense. And to be honest, in the very beginning, I never, so I use tense as a means to, I guess, like figure out what the best way to tell the story is. If it's, you can write a story in past tense and be like, no, this will be much more effective if it's in present tense. Just because you can get closer in some ways to the characters, to the situations, to the tension. And so that's how I approach tense. And the same is with point of view. This book is entirely first person. And so it doesn't move away from that. But point of view too is also, what happens if you rewrote one of the stories in third person, what might that look like? Which I had tried and I had done, and it was very strange. David almost became a ghost when I did that. It was very weird. But with tense, with the first person, with Safe Harbor, I didn't intend originally for that story to be in this collection. It was actually an autobiographical piece at first. For those of you who have heard me talk before, or if this is the first time, there are moments in this book, where I've drawn from, life experiences, and Safe Harbor is one of those moments. My mother, when she was alive, she had severe depression and struggled with alcoholism, and she would go to these crisis stabilization units that are, very, very important places for people to get rest and to recuperate. And, I would go and visit her, and she'd always want me to bring her cigarettes and stuff. And, we'd hang out and have coffee and eat lunch and chit chat and watch TV. And one day when I was up there, I witnessed her have a seizure, and it was one of the most frightening things I'd ever seen. And so when I got home that day, I wrote every detail down that I could, because I was like, there's something that I need to do with this, and not to publish per se, but like there's something I needed to figure out. And it sat in a folder up until the point where she had the seizure, for a year. And then finally I was like, okay, I'll use fiction now. I'll turn this into auto fiction and extend it. And it just sort of, I wrote it in present tense because that's how it felt to me in the moment, like very, very immediate. And, in revising it, I was like, this needs to remain in present tense. So for me, it's all about, getting as close as you can to that feeling, getting a reader to feel, because if I start writing something and I'm not feeling anything, I feel like I'm on the wrong track. But if I start writing something and I feel like I'm feeling something, then I know I'm on the right path. And usually the reader, if they have a heart and soul, will feel it. Will feel it too.
Yeah, that's great. So you started working on the initial version of this in 2015. So it's had kind of a long gestation then. And then you've been through the whole publishing process kind of during the pandemic, right? How has that affected things, or has it particularly?
It hasn't affected too much. I got very, very lucky in that my book came out just this past July, when places just started to do like in-person events again. There were so many books that came out, what was it, between 2020 and July 2022, really that spring of 2022, books that had come out where everything was online, everything was virtual. It was an entirely new world. And I didn't have a book come out then, but I had I was like a fellow for Maine Writers and Publishers Alliance, and we did virtual events and stuff, and it made a lot of things possible. I think, interestingly enough, it also made things just impossible and difficult. But I was just very lucky for this book to come out at the end where I don't want to say COVID's over because it's not, we're just sort of like pretending it is. We're like Texas. They've been pretending since it happened. I say that just because my friend is always talking about it, who's from Texas. But yeah, it didn't. I was, it was great to see people and to like do things after being locked down for so long and, not going anywhere. I think it was Birch Bark Books in Minneapolis, Louise Erdrich's bookstore. I went out there, and that was the first live event they'd done in 2 years. It was really, really great. So I got lucky. I got lucky with COVID not.
Good.
Yeah.
Yeah. Yeah, it's been very interesting to see how the kind of trends in publishing and authors' ability to do things has shifted during this time. So hopefully we come out at a better place overall. Good. So one of the things that I really appreciated about this text is the casual use of transliterated words from the Penobscot language, with which I will admit I had no prior acquaintance myself. But I was thinking, oh, it's got a touch of, say, you might call it Spanglish, you might call it Franglais if there were a different language involved. And occasionally a word is directly translated, but often they're not. You pick it up from the context, and I found it, that the writing did a great job at providing enough context that you understand what the word means. Can you speak a little more about your relationship with the languages in the book and how you thought about including non-English words and idioms?
Yeah, that's a great question. So I was really, I'm glad that the words that stood by themselves with no explanation were able to be understood. That was my big thing, was like, I feel like this comes back to this idea of like performing for a readership that isn't Indigenous. I think it can be very easy to put culture on display or language on display. And so I was very much against that. So whenever there were moments in the book for me to get away without defining a word, by using context, I did it. But there were a lot of instances where I couldn't, and it felt very alienating, I think, for a reader. So there were a couple deliberate choices I made. One, I chose to offer those definitions because there are readers who are non-native who won't know what the words are, and there's an argument to be like, well, too bad, you know what I mean? But then there's also Penobscot readers who actually don't know what some of the words are, like they didn't grow up hearing them, or maybe they did, but they're like, oh, I forgot about that, right? And it's like, I think it's just important that the book be accessible in that way. And like, that's just my thinking for this book. And, I've written, essays, for the Georgia Review where I'd use, the actual spellings of the words with the alphabet system that's been created. And there's like a lot of power in seeing that in print. But with this, I was like, I'm going to go with phonetics. I'm going to keep it simple. But plus it also was just, I think, sort of like a historical marker for me. Like, it represents what I know about the language. Like, that's how I grew up spelling these words. That's how I still spell them, when I write. I have to look up the actual spellings of words, when I go to use them. And so it almost is like, if I'm going to do it that way, I want to stay true to how I know it, how I'm associated with the language. And yeah, I don't like future wise. I'm always like, I don't know how I'm going to do it next time. Will I go with the phonetic spelling? Will I choose the appropriate spelling? It'll be interesting to see.
Yeah, thank you. One of the themes in the book that really struck me, and this may just show that I read the wrong books, I don't know, but I was struck by how often the sense of smell is a motivating factor in the characters' actions. And sometimes it's really funny, the scene in the church is, and sometimes it's comforting. There's smells of home, there's the parental figures cooking, but usually it's unpleasant smells. And the segment with the caterpillars, anybody who's read the book will remember the segment with the caterpillars is very striking. I mean, maybe especially because I think I was sitting on the subway wearing a mask, and like and reading this section. So So I feel like that's relatively rare in fiction. People are usually being motivated by sight or sound, but less by smell. Am I wrong about that? Or how and when did you choose to make smell a central element?
I think to be honest, I think I kind of did it subconsciously. I recall having workshopped experiences where instructors would point out they're like this piece has, when we talk about sensory details, this piece has this piece has every sensory detail except there's not a single smell. And I recall that happening, a couple times with pieces I had submitted when I was, in my early 20s. And I I think I was sort of like wounded by it. I was like, I need to make sure that there's always a smell, in my story somewhere. And perhaps I overshot to such an extent that it ended up like I ended up using it as a means to extend a story or to extend a situation. But you're right. I think, you know, sound and sight are the two like dominating factors. I talk about this with my students in creative writing. I'm like, we want to ground readers in the world through, specificity and sensory details, and we list them, sound, sight, touch, smell, and then there's taste. And so I'm like, maybe my next batch of stories, I'll try to figure out how I can get at character motivations with taste. That might be a weird way of it might be some weird stuff, but it's one of the it's at the bottom of the totem pole. I think sight and sound are the ones that like really get a story going, but smell is just so important. Like it just, for me anyways, like thinking about smell, it's just like you get a whiff of something and then there's automatically this whole new memory that comes to you, right? And it's just a phenomenal sense, and I thought it deserved subconsciously a lot of space.
Yeah, yeah, it makes a lot of sense. And a somewhat related question. I kind of feel like the book expresses various ways of living close to nature, which is a somewhat freighted concept, perhaps, because there's living close to nature in the sense that you can find your way through the woods, which is true of David or Dee much of the time. And then there's living close to nature in the sense that there's always a blade of grass in your darn iced tea. It's close to nature, but it's not necessarily positive. How did you balance those qualities in the stories?
I think for me, it was really, I feel like that balance came about by treating place as a character. Like I think of place and setting as a being. And I mean, it really is, if, we think about, if we do something to somebody, they're going to react, right? Say we kick their shin, they're going to react in some way. The earth, the place is exactly like that, right? Like when there's fracking that occurs, the earth, eventually has earthquakes because of that. It responds to the damage that's done to it. And so I'm always thinking about the ways that the characters are moving about the world, but I'm also thinking about how the world is allowing the characters to move through it. Thinking about, that, reminding readers that place is always there, even when you're drinking your iced tea, right? That blade of grass is like in there, and we can't escape it, and it becomes a responsibility in a way. It becomes, as much as these characters are responsible for one another, they're also responsible for this very place that's holding them and keeping them, alive, really. And so for me, it was really about, that balance came from approaching place as, a character. What does place want, in a sense? And it's not a very, it's not an environmental book by any means, but it treats place, I think, the way place needs to be treated.
Yeah, I would say the environment, the physical space is extremely important. It's not an environmental book in the sense of being preachy about it in any way. Not that there isn't a need for those things too, but it's a separate it's a separate genre and style. Yeah, that's great. So maybe expanding on this a little bit. So one emotionally fraught point in the stories, the narrator is in a car crash and sustains a serious leg injury. And he says, and I had to go and write this down. I just says, and have you ever tried to walk in such a time of great rupture? And of course, he's referring to the actual injury that he's just sustained as he's reacting to it. But great rupture, of course, can also refer to the broken sense of time that we get from the stories being in the order they're in, the issues among his family members, his community, larger society, nature. That jumped out to me. Should it jump out?
I think it should. Yeah, I think rupture. There's a great sense of that as like a theme, I think, throughout this entire book. I mean, like the collection itself is like a story that had been strung together, but then it sort of blew up and ruptured, and we're left with these fragments of it. You know what I mean? And I think the theme of rupture is all throughout. And at that moment, Dee's definitely talking about his leg, but he's talking about everything else. He's talking about the pain and loneliness he feels with the distance between him and his mother. He's, I think, also talking about his past histories that you find out later on in the later David stories. And so it's this moment, I think, where we actually like look down into the crater that is this if I always use metaphors that I don't like, that belong to disciplines I don't know very much about, but if a comet had come and crashed and left a giant gaping hole, like that's the moment in the book where we're looking down at like that hole. In a sense, that's where he's at his lowest.
Yeah. And just particularly that it says, and have you ever tried to walk? Because I guess I venture some of what has been happening to this guy almost his entire life is that he's kind of had to walk through this great rupture.
Yeah, he's had to walk on that busted leg, metaphorically. He's had to endure it, right? And like I think that's another big theme, is this sense of endurance, this sense of persistence, persisting into the next day, even though it might just be the same as the one before.
Yeah. That is it's powerful stuff. So toward the end of the book, a tragic event takes place, and coincidentally, there's a documentary film crew present on the reservation, and they're not from there, but they're visiting there. And to their credit, they try kind of ineffectually to help with what's going on, but they're also filming, or somebody is filming what's happening, as though this were some kind of performance stage for them, even though it's a general episode of trauma for the actual people. Any thoughts to share about how and why people in general tend to rubberneck at tragedy, or what's the human nature element of that? Perhaps why Americans particularly do it, perhaps why especially outsiders do it to minorities?
It's a great question. I think it all comes back or comes down to capitalism. It's a thing that sells. Tragedy really is. It's a thing that sells. I mean, you think of fundraising efforts for anything at all, it has to do with tragedy. It has to do with trauma, and I'm not saying that's a bad thing at all, but money comes in because of that stuff. When somebody has a particularly horrific story, somebody is somebody at some production company hears about it, they're going to try to profit off of it in some way, right? They're like, oh, the public needs to know about this, and like the public does, but like maybe not for millions, for like this like profit gain. And so like I feel like there has been so much literature or text. I'll just use the broad term text to encompass not just literature, but TV and media and all of that stuff. There's so many texts being published that are very like, I'm going to just put trauma in your face to make you like feel like to conjure up this emotion that is authentically inauthentic, if that makes sense. And to get a reaction. And we've just become accustomed to seeing trauma and tragedy over and over and over again. And, I can hear the irony because there's some of that in my book as well. But it's like, for me, I was very much like, okay, I'm going to tell, the truth. I'm not going to shy away from things that need to be shown or things that need to be told. but I'm not going to forget to put the humanity for these characters. You know, like whenever there's like a bad moment, like these people are there for each other in the end of the day. You know, I think of Burn in the opening, you know, and there's the traumatic moment of the hair and all this stuff, and just not good things. And, you know, they get to Fellis's house, and Dee is like, narrates, he goes, you know, Fellis walked fine by himself, but I still walked with him up the steps. Like thinking it like these, finding these tiny details to make these characters there for each other in case they fall. But yeah, I don't know why, you know, I think it definitely does have to do with money. I think it has to do with, you know, it's like if big publishers, you know, keep pushing out this type of, you know, that type of narrative, you know, the trauma, the misery porn, so to speak, and they put it out, it's in a way telling us or telling readers that this is what you should be reading. Like, this is the good stuff. And so like, that's why I think indie and small presses are so important right now, is because they're pushing work out that's doing, I think, what we need is stories that aren't the same one over and over again, you know, the same sad story. Not to say that those sad stories shouldn't be told, but I just think I hear from other writers the way publishers sort of like, and even producers want certain writings to go a certain direction. I had a friend who was doing an adaptation for an HBO show, and they kept telling her, they're like, okay, you need to add more rape. You need to add more rape. You need to add more rape. So finally she was like, I'm not doing this anymore and you're not getting this. And she quit. But yeah, it's very, very strange, but it has to do with the shock factor. It has to do with like, there's just so many more ways to tell stories than that. And I feel like we're slowly getting away from it.
Commodification might be
Yeah.
a word that, yeah. Even well-intentioned
Yeah.
commodification really is, yeah, interesting. Um, yeah, and thinking in part of the context of the trauma that does occur in these stories. So the characters are obviously imperfect, you know, kind of from the moment we meet them. I think they're appealing but imperfect largely. Protagonists are frequently under the influence of various substances. There's casual violence. There's some actual criminality. People just make some bad choices, even when sometimes they could make some better choices. But part of what makes the book so compelling, I think, is that we find out about the personal and complex reasons for those things. That, and it's not a one-to-one comparison. It's out of this entire context these choices have been made. Again, Tommy Orange, I think, put it very well. He said, I kept wanting to read and know more about these characters' lives, how they ended up where they ended up. And this is kind of an unfolding of this whole thing. So did you consider initially making the characters more model citizens? Did you feel any pressure to do so? And I'm going to toss in one more thing, because I noted that to the Boston Globe, you said the synopsis doesn't quite get it right when it says what it means to be Penobscot, because it gives the impression that these are representative people, when obviously they're not. They're their own people. So model citizens.
Yeah, no, I am totally, I feel like, does a model citizen exist? I don't know. I think for me, it's like, I'm really interested in capturing not just the good and not just the bad, but the strange, messy in between of the two. And I think in order to do that, I had these characters struggle with these types of substance abuse issues or these types of traumas and tragedies, in part because, a lot of those themes, a lot of those elements were, things I experienced growing up. And so it was like, it could be quick for people to be like, oh, alcoholism in Native literature is a trope, or, substance abuse is a trope, or, whatever they are. But at the end of the day, it's still a reality for some people, Native and non-Native. And so, yeah, I don't think I ever set out to have them be model citizens in any way, but rather to just capture these characters for who they were, these messy, lovely people, who can be good and can be bad, and can also be like, I don't really know what to make of you, in the way that, real people are.
Yeah, that's great. So the last question that I was going to ask really is about the title, which we know is the title of one of the stories as well as of the volume. And I see we have a related question from an audience member. So I came in thinking that this was kind of a semi-rhyming nod to George Romero's classic zombie movies, of course, Night of the Living Dead and so forth. But as I read, I realized it's more than that, that there are actually numerous references to people or creatures who are dead but not gone, or buried but not dead, or hovering somewhere between life and death, or there are supernatural elements, or are there? So if you could talk a little bit more about the title. And the related question we have here is from my friend, the aspiring folklorist, who wonders about the impact of Penobscot folktale and your background or interest in that, anything to recommend in that area?
Yeah.
It was a lot.
Yeah.
I
think for the last question, talking about tales and folklore, there's this book that came out in June of 2021 called Still They Remember Me. I'll actually, let's see. I don't know if you'll be able to see this in the chat, but.
Oh, yes, thank you.
Still They Remember Me, Penobscot Transformer Tales, Volume 1. So this is a really cool project that took stories that had been written down by an anthropologist a long time ago from Penobscot elders, and they retell them here, and they they tell the tales in Penobscot, and then they also tell the tales in English. So it's very, very cool. So I would definitely check that out. And I think there are other books out there that have Penobscot tales, mainly stories about Gluskabe or Gluskab, who is Penobscotan or Wabanaki sort of cultural hero in a sense. And his name translates to the man from nothing. So he's sort of this, he was sort of just created by the creator, and the creator asked him to create life. And it was so fascinating. I was at an event in Portland, Maine, doing a reading, and one of the persons who worked on this book, Connor Quinn, was there, and he was the linguist who came in the 90s and created the current alphabet system we have, and worked with the elders and everything. And he came up when we were chatting at the end of my reading, and he's like, I kept reading D as being Gluskabe, this like man from nothing. And I was like, where were you when I was writing this book? I was like, it's such a great thing to hear, and like, I wonder how that would have nurtured his character a bit, to think about him a little bit more in the context of traditional storytelling. But yeah, I hope that answers that question. And I think that's a great source. What was the first question again?
Just thinking about the title, that I kept seeing new resonances with the title, and I was wondering what the title meant to you.
Yeah, so the title for me is, I wish this had made it on the back jacket of the synopsis, but on the online synopsis, it says, it poses the question, how did the living come back to life? And so, I think in many ways, like a lot of the characters in this, especially in the Dee and Fellis stories, the characters are alive, but are they really, are they alive? And so it's kind of a play on that, and thinking about zombie as being this, like if I say zombie, I imagine everybody has an image of what they think, right? And, taking that archetypal, statue in a way, but then using it in a way that doesn't quite make sense, trying to destabilize that archetype, move it away from its traditional meaning. Because like you said, there's so many different, elements, whether it be horror or, supernatural. And I think I just sort of like was not dedicated to committing to one of them. I wanted to let it sort of be. And as for how I came up with the title, I don't know. I just like one day I was like, oh, I'm going to name this story Night of the Living Rez. I think because I had the zombie episode playing, or the Dawn of the
Mhm.
Dead, I think it is, maybe in
Mhm.
the end of
Mhm.
the story. And so I was like, I'm going to call this Night of the Living Rez, and just sort of out of parody and, maybe
Mhm.
satire. And the original title for the whole book was actually The Little Yellow House. And I had a mentor who was reading it, and he was like, I think you should call this Night of the Living Rez. And he explained, he was like, because if I had saw this at a bookstore, it would jump off at the shelves at me. And I never realized
Mhm.
that until, because I never was really thinking about, like making money off the book or anything like that. But the moment he said it, I was like, oh my God, you're right. That is an amazing title.
Mhm.
Um, but yeah, that's how I think of the title, and I love it. I
Mhm.
would never change it. Although
Yeah.
some people on Goodreads have been very upset that it's made its way onto horror lists, and I don't blame them because they pick it up and I
Ah.
think they think it's like going to be about like zombies on a reservation. So I don't blame them for being upset about that. I don't know how the book ends up on those lists. It just does. I apologize to any of you out there who are angered by that.
Yes, just to be very clear, they're not literal zombies, and
Yeah.
this is not a horror book. Yeah. Well, disappointed expectations. Um, so, um, so yes, I think the title is tremendously effective. And if only before I read a word of the book, I was like, it's funny, just the satire aspect of it. And so I want to toss in, first of all, audience members, please do add your questions and comments in the chat on the right of your screen, and we'll be happy to throw them into the conversation. But I was also just going to comment that the book is really funny, including at a lot of, to me anyway, unexpected moments where it seems like things are dire, and then no, it's actually maybe both dire and funny. Um, how did the humor get in there? Is it intentionally not exactly comic relief, or maybe some of it is relief? How
Yeah.
to write humor is otherwise serious.
Yeah, I mean, you need humor, and I mean, humor is such a subjective element. You never know what people will find funny. There are people who have read my book who I know have, I mean, I don't really know, but I speculate, found nothing funny
Mhm.
about it, found it to just be pure trauma, and they're like, I'm done with it. And so there's only so much you can do with what you'll expect a reader will find funny. Um,
Mhm.
I think occasionally the book has characters make a couple jokes, and
Mhm.
jokes are one thing, but humor is a different thing in
Mhm.
entirely. And for me, it was about, if you're going to have such tragedy or such trauma, you need to have equally enough humor to alleviate
Mhm.
that pressure, that buildup. And I heard somebody say once, it's like, if you can make someone laugh, they'll follow you anywhere. And so it's like, if I can get people to laugh, I can get them to go to hell with me. I can get them to,
Mhm.
see, have to deal with these terrible things. And my
Mhm.
approach to writing it is I'm just sort of like very irreverent, and like I just find humor in things that aren't always appropriately funny, given the
Mhm.
context of situations. But that's just how I grew up. Like whenever there was something,
Mhm.
I always remember, like, whenever anything traumatic ever happened and there were, ever tears, that somebody had in their eyes, it always ended with laughter in some way, like laughing at either
Mhm.
ourselves, laughing at the absurdity of the situation, laughing at, the things that were out of our control. And, I feel like
Mhm.
that's really, captured when, Mom and Food for the Common Cold just has that breakdown of laughter, like at the end, where she's
Mhm.
just hysterically laughing, and it's not like a very funny moment, but that's
Mhm.
the type of like humor I grew up around, and it was
Mhm.
very much just sort of like in my blood to put that in the page in a way.
Mhm. A sort of just, can you believe this shit?
Yeah, yeah.
Possibly, yeah, yeah. Um, no, I think that's extremely effective. Um, so, um, just kind of broadening out again, I want to say the threatened question, is there anything that you would like to share about current or future projects? And specifically, someone asks, do you have any stories that maybe are already kind of in the trunk that might get cycled into, as indeed happened with this one, that some of it had been shelved and then drew back in it, or
Yeah.
something's in the works?
um yeah, if I have any projects in the works right now.
Mhm.
Yeah, I have. So a couple things I'm working on. I actually, everybody who's been going to my events like knows this, but it hasn't been like officially announced anywhere. But my next book, a novel called Fire Exit, is coming out from Tin House in 2024. And that book deals with, I'm not going to describe it just because I describe it so poorly. I finally understand the saying, never ask a novelist what their book is about. But this book tackles blood quantum, which is federally recognized tribes have to keep track of citizenship, and it's up to the tribes to choose how they do it. But most tribes have just adopted blood quantum, which is a Western notion, which really is it's just a further act of genocide. But in order to be an enrolled member of a tribe, for Penobscot, you need to at least be 25% Penobscot. And so this book deals with characters who are and who are not Native, and also about a character who is on the census, but technically should not be. And so it's this, story about not necessarily what it means to be, Native, but what it means to live in a world where there is this strange structure imposed on them and how that affects their behavior. So that's the novel that's coming out. And then I'm slowly working on a first draft of a book that deals with child welfare practices in the state of Maine. So it focuses on the tentative title of the book is the Year of the Frog Clan. And it's a mother who has lost her children for the 11th time, and she has one final opportunity to get them back. She keeps sort of losing them and messing up, and she has 3 children. So it's sort of their story. I'm still figuring it out. And then the other project is I've been wanting to actually write a zombie novel or something that is related to it. There's this word in Penobscot. I don't know how. I think it's said like Naka, and it just means the dead. And I just kind of want to use it to reinvent this idea of like a zombie apocalypse type thing. I keep envisioning it being set like 200 years in the future, and this indigenous community, the Penobscot Nation, which is a literal island, has like flourished and like revitalized itself. And then, I don't know, a stranger comes to town or somebody goes on a journey, which is, the 2 tenets of great literature.
Yes. That's great. Wow. So a lot of irons in the fire. That's terrific. We will look forward to them. I just was going to say miscellaneously, the blood quantum topic, I think strikes me as very relevant, because I can tell you folks who are not Native have very limited understanding of both the history and the present day applications of that. And I am struck by your saying it is another form of genocide. One of our participants in the chat mentions about the title Night of the Living Rez, reminds me of the idea that colonization never killed indigenous culture, but indigenous culture is waiting to be reawakened, or perhaps is in the process of being reawakened in some ways. So
I know, I read that and I was like, where were you when I was writing this book?
It's a great concept. So is there anything that you would like to talk about on any topic at all within reason that we haven't addressed?
I don't think so. I feel like we've covered a lot of ground.
Any favorite tip for aspiring writers of short stories or of interconnected short stories?
Yeah. Keep at it. Don't think that, you're going to spend a lot of time writing stuff that isn't very good. That's okay. I wrote terrible stuff. But I think the biggest thing is, and, this is something I've learned over the past, several years, is that I feel like the word failure always gets tossed around when it comes to a piece of writing a lot. Like, oh, this piece fails. It's not working. It's not being successful. It's not a good story, right? And I think, it's true. There are stories that are good. There are stories that are bad. But I would never characterize bad stories as failing stories, because I always feel like when we write those bad stories, they're a step in the right direction for producing what will ultimately be that successful story. Like, I can't tell you how many of the stories that exist in this collection exist because I had written, 2, 3, or 4 failed different versions. Food for the Common Cold only exists because I wrote this 30-page story that had nothing to do with the central conflict in Food for the Common Cold, but ultimately led me to the idea of it. Like if I hadn't written it, I wouldn't have never written Food for the Common Cold. And so really that's my advice, is to keep at it, and to know that it is a process, and that it is work, but there's a strange, I don't want to say mystical element, but there's something strange about it, at least the way I approach writing. You know, in my mind, story would exist without us. You know, if we were not here, story would still occur. And so it's almost like this thing we have to barter with, we have to sort of communicate with in order to, you know, tell a story. You know, whenever we encounter resistance in a story, or a story isn't working, you know, maybe we're working the story in a way it doesn't want to be worked, right? Maybe the story wants to take control a little bit. So yeah, biggest advice is avoid outlines. Just write. just be messy. Yeah,
Wow.
and then maybe outline after that, but dive in. You know, just explore. You know, see what's out there.
Cool. And anything you've read lately, or that you're looking forward to reading, that we should be have on our radars?
Oh, yes, but I'm going to draw blanks on like all of the names, but I will try to remember
That's
them. I think it came out
I put you on the
in
spot.
June, but Nuclear Family by Joseph Hahn
Mm,
is a very, very good book. It's really funny. It was just a wonderful read. Chelsea T. Hicks' short story collection, A Calm and Normal Heart. She's an Indigenous writer. Very good collection of stories. And Louise Erdrich gave it a very stellar blurb. So there you go.
good. Well, thank you so much for joining us. It's been an absolute pleasure, and I think certainly do read Night of the Living Rez. Audience members, I'm going to pop in the chat one more time all the links of things you can do, including buying your copy of the book from our independent friends at the corner bookstore. And we will look forward to reading more of your work. Morgan Talty, thank you so much for joining
Thank
us.
you for having me. Thank you, everybody.